6 days. That's how long the most famous psychology experiment of the 20th century was supposed to run. For decades, you've probably heard the story the same way everyone else has. Ordinary people, given power, turned cruel almost instantly. Proof that the right situation can make anyone dangerous. It's been taught in textbooks, quoted in documentaries, repeated so many times, it stopped sounding like a claim and started sounding like a fact. But a few years ago, researchers went back and found something the original study never mentioned. Actual recordings of the person running the experiment, coaching participants on how to behave before the shocking results ever happened. And once you hear what's on those recordings, it's hard to unhear it. Here's the version you almost certainly learned. Researchers randomly assigned ordinary college students to play either guards or prisoners in a simulated environment. Within days, the guards grew abusive, the prisoners grew distressed, and the whole thing had to be shut down early because it got too real too fast. The lesson everyone walked away with was simple and unsettling. It's not about who you are. It's about the role you're placed in. Put a normal person in a position of power with no accountability, and cruelty doesn't take long to show up. That conclusion has been repeated in psychology classes, true crime documentaries, corporate ethics trainings, and internet debates for decades. You've probably cited it yourself without ever tracing it back to the original source, which is exactly the problem. The story became so useful, so quotable, that almost nobody went back to check if it actually happened the way it's always been told. Here's where it gets specific. A researcher went back through the original archives years later, audio recordings, planning notes, personal correspondence from the study itself, material that had technically been available, but that almost nobody had actually sat down and reviewed in full. What surfaced wasn't a story about ordinary people spontaneously turning cruel. It was a study where the person running it had, according to the recordings, directly coached at least one participant on how a tough guard should act before the behavior the study became famous for had ever occurred. Some participants who played guards later said in interviews that they were essentially performing a role they believed the researchers wanted to see. Not discovering some dark side of themselves, but doing what they thought the study required of them. And several people involved in the original planning reportedly described the environment as far less spontaneous than it was later portrayed, closer to a loosely directed performance than a controlled scientific observation. None of this proves the opposite of the original claim. It doesn't mean ordinary people are incapable of cruelty under pressure. Other separate research still points that direction. What it does mean is that this specific study, the one everyone learned as the proof, may not have been proof of anything at all. So sit with what that actually means. This wasn't a case of one exaggerated detail. It was one of the most cited findings in psychology, referenced in courtrooms, taught to new students as foundational, used to explain everything from prison abuse scandals to corporate misconduct, and the foundation underneath it may have been softer than anyone was told. Which raises a harder question than was this one study flawed. It's how many other things you consider settled fact are you actually just trusting because enough people repeated them with enough confidence? You didn't personally verify this study. Neither did most of the professors who taught it, most of the writers who cited it, most of the people who've used it in an argument at some point without ever reading the original data. The uncomfortable part was never really about one experiment from decades ago. It's about how much of what feels like knowledge is actually just repetition, confident, well-intentioned, and never checked. You came into this video believing a fact that millions of people believe. That's not a flaw in you. It's just what happens when something gets repeated enough times by confident-sounding people. But if the most famous psychology study in modern history could go 5 decades before anyone properly checked it, What does that say about the other things you've never thought to question? Not because they're all wrong, but because you've never actually looked.